Good afternoon. I say good afternoon because it's just afternoon where I am. I'm in Jericho, Vermont, 15 miles east of Lake Champlain. And welcome to all the various countries, and especially to Linda Hadid, who has been a correspondent of mine in the past. Each one of these supervision meetings, I'm going to start off with a 15-minute or 20-minute lecture, and then we'll go right into the cases. I want to start off with the most important thing, which is Fairbairn's confusing, difficult, and often annoying structural theory. We're so used to thinking in the world of psychoanalysis of id, ego, and superego. That's what we're used to thinking. And along comes Fairbairn, and he has pairs. He has three pairs of self and object. And these pairs shift around. They come up, they come down, they get dissociated, they return. And it's very, very difficult to identify who is speaking. And that's the first thing you need to know in a clinical session is who is speaking. Which one of these six possibilities is speaking to you? Because if you don't know who you're talking to, you're going to make some interventions that are just not, will not succeed. Now, where does this structural theory come from? It comes from parental failures. You're always, in a psychoanalytic model, you're always looking for the first cause. What is the cause of this whole cascade of issues that turn out to be psychopathology? What is the first cause that starts to produce this structural theory? In Freud, what's the first cause? The first cause is the id's aggression and sexuality that can't be contained initially. That's the first cause there. The first cause here is a child who experiences caretaking, which is a failure. Caretaking, I say caretaking in quotes. It might be abuse. It might be neglect. It might be anything, but it's not what the child needs to develop. And to an infant and a young child, this is a disaster. This is a disaster because the mother is the only person in the world. That's the whole world is the mother or the caretaker. If that caretaker fails, the child collapses. How does the child protect themselves from collapsing? Well, what they do is they dissociate. Now, dissociation has been in the field a long time, long before Fairbairn, but it fell out of favor with Freud, who assumed that we were born with an id, and therefore the id didn't get there via dissociation. It got there through biology and inheritance, and therefore he talked about repression. Fairbairn's unconscious is empty at birth, and all these traumatic events, which cannot be accepted by the child's nascent ego, it's unacceptable. It's horrifying for the child to remember, for instance, that her mother locked her in the closet. Now, I use this example because I have an adult friend who was locked in the closet through much of her childhood. It's just amazing. Her mother locked her in the closet, left the house. It's too traumatic to remember all these events. So the child dissociates them, shoves them into the unconscious, and they sit in the unconscious. Well, that's why the children, after terrible events, just go on as if nothing happened. Well, to them, nothing did happen because they can't remember it because it's in their unconscious. When these events happen again and again and again, each one of these events is like putting a nickel into a piggy bank. They start to coalesce in the unconscious if there's many of them. If it's only once or twice, it's not so bad. But if there's 10,000 of them or 5,000 of them, they begin to coalesce and form a sub personality, a second personality. And this personality is a frightened, humiliated, enraged, bitter, frightened, tremulous child in relationship with a neglectful, again, if you lock your child in a closet, as she was locked all through her childhood till about 14. All these things pile up. So you develop a view of yourself and a view of the object, which is not available to your consciousness. Why is it not available? Because if it were available on a moment-to-moment basis, you would feel an existential panic. You have no safety, you have no love, you're in danger all the time, you're hated. Where are you going to go? And no 6-year-old leaves the house and knocks on the neighbor's door and says, I'm your new child because I can't stand my mother. Never happens. The child adapts itself to the horror that it lives in. So the first structure that develops in abuse and neglect is called the anti-libidinal ego by Fairbairn. And it relates to the parent when they were rejecting, abusive, neglectful, whatever you want to call it, whatever the variant of parental failure was going on. That viewpoint is reinforced again and again and again by each and every incident of abuse and neglect. And so you can see in children in neglectful families, they grow and they grow and they grow. And this becomes a very powerful sub-personality, substructure, ego state, whatever you want to call it. It's a sub-personality or sub-ego. And it sees the world. All it sees is the rejecting object. That's all it sees. And that's what it relates to. Thanks to a guy named Thomas Ogden in California, an analyst who's written on Fairbairn. He introduced the idea that these structures talk to each other in the inner world, and they do. That there's a constant back and forth with the rejecting object saying, I told you you never, I'm making this up. I told you never amount to anything. I told you you have to study. You're stupid. You're wasting your life. All this ugly, hostile stuff, if it's that style family. And then the anti-libidinal ego says, I'm not that bad. Don't tell me that. I'm a good, blah, blah. It's a very contentious, aggressive, internalized relationship that goes on and on and on in conscious. Well, no child can live in constant despair. Even though this material is dissociated, there's still, as Stephen Mitchell said, a mother that fails the child when she's 3 or 4 is not going to become a great mother when the child is 9 and 10. The failures go on and on and on and on. So what the child does is create hope for itself because it needs to cling to something. It creates hope for itself with a second view of the object. What's the second view? The second view is that mom once took me to the movies. Mom once bought me this little gift. Mom once sat down and talked to me about this or that. Each of these very small incidents is expanded and becomes the basis for the hopeful self or the libidinal ego. I'm using the word hopeful self. That's the word I used in some of the books for the average person, but Fairbairn called it the libidinal ego, who relates to the parent as an exciting object. Why do I say exciting? Well, it's a great word. Because if you've ever seen an infant, like a 4 or 5 month infant, And mom walks suddenly into the room. The kid starts kicking away, and you can't wait. That's an exciting, mom is an exciting object. You can't wait till mom gets there and he holds it, kisses it, feeds it, plays with it, talks to it. That's an exciting event. That's a great description. So the child creates this exciting object for itself and lives in the fantasy. I mean, so here we have the second ego structure, which is called the libidinal ego, and it sees the parent as an exciting object. Now, what about normal? Let's say you have a normal childhood, and you have many times when the parent is sitting down with you, talking with you, helping you draw something, doing some work for school with you, being interested in what. Well, these are internalized too. Fairbairn, by the way, didn't get it. He thought this was sort of a different category. Only the bad categories were internalized and remembered. It's wrong. Fairbairn made error after error after error in this model, and the idea that somehow the central ego develops in a different way, and that you don't need to internalize a good object. These are all mistakes he made. You do internalize good objects. He said you don't need to because your good object is right there. You don't need to carry them in your head. They're right there. Well, what if they're dead? Or how come the central ego behaves differently than the two other structures? It doesn't. They're all the same. You have to have consistency in your mind. So how does the central ego grow? The same way that the two unconscious ones grow. Every event adds a little bit to its structure. So if your parent is used to sitting down with you, talking with you about school, helping you write things, or whatever the job is, you remember this in not each incident, but they grow, they add together, and they grow a view of yourself in relationship to a view of your object. And that's the central ego relating to the parent as an ideal object. All right. So these grow under good conditions. And you remember that object. You cherish that object. You remember the feelings, just like the anti-libidinal ego remembers the hateful feelings, and the libidinal ego remembers those few incidents of love and support. That's how it works. They all grow the same way. So it's easy to say that mental health is based on the relationship of the percentages. How many times were you treasured, loved, and supported? How many times were you slapped around, hated, or neglected, or made a mockery of? And how many times did you have to support your relationship to your parents with these outrageous fantasies of being loved when in fact there was no love there whatsoever? So this is the structural theory. There's three pairs of self and object. This chokes everybody up in the field. Oh, so Ina and I were talking about doing a new diagram. My old diagram was not very good. Oh, by the way, all Fairbairnians do diagrams. Fairbairn put a diagram of his model on page 105 of his original book. So ever since then, everybody that writes about Fairbairn has to do a diagram. It's sort of a requirement. And I had one that wasn't so hot, but Ina and I talked about it, and I said, let's try this one. So we have new diagrams of what the structural theory looks like in a picture. Okay. Are you ready, Ina? So let's have the normal functioning. Here's what normal functioning looks like in Fairbairn's theory. There it is. This is the normal functioning. At the top, we have the central ego, which is relating to the parent as an ideal object and taking in good memories and being supported, exploring the world, separating from the parent step by step. That's another lecture about how rejection stops your development. And that's a different topic, and we'll do that next time. But here, the parent is supporting you. What happens? Well, you're now able to go overnight to a friend's house when you're 12 years old. You don't need to stay home with mom. You can go out and meet new people, talk to them. You can go to class without being nervous. You can go into a class play. or you can do a talk in front, a little report in front of the class. The central ego develops and gets stronger and stronger through every positive, supportive interaction. Underneath, so every ego has to have an object that it relates to. That's object relations. We don't come out of our sexual aggression id. We come out of relationships with other people. That's what develops the human personality. It's a different philosophical starting point than Freud. Okay. What do we have in the unconscious? Well, uh, you have to imagine here a little bit, but let's say you came from a really bad family. Your anti-libidinal ego and your rejecting object structures are pretty big. This actually is like a pretty bad family because the central ego is not as big as it should be in a really good family. And the anti-libidinal ego in the picture is a little bigger than it should be. But here we have the anti-libidinal ego and rejecting object. It's loaded. It's loaded with memories. Look at how big that thing is. We can't make 40 pictures like a good family, a less good family, a less good family. But anyway, this would be a less good family right here. The anti-libidinal ego and rejecting object quite large. And there's the line there, the consciousness and the unconsciousness. And then, of course, when you have an anti-libidinal ego that big, you have to have a libidinal ego to keep you attached to your objects, if you follow me. You don't need a libidinal ego if your parents are good, because they're good. You don't have a lot of anti-libidinal. You don't have to create fantasies that they're good, because they are good, okay? But when they're not good, you need the fantasies. So this shows, just because of the relationship, the size, this shows functioning of a person that has a big unconscious. The other thing is you can see, this is absolutely true to life, that there's a relationship between the power of the unconscious and the power of the consciousness. That is, the better central ego you have, the less you're going to be paying attention to your anti-libidinal ego and your libidinal ego. This is a great point, and I want to flash a magazine. It's the most astonishing article I have read in years. It's in the New Yorker. It's the lead, and it's in December 20th and January 6th. The New Yorker comes out every week. This is a double issue because they take off for Christmas. And it's about, and we have a Canadian person here, Dawn, I believe, said she was from Canada. It's about Alice Munro, who was sadistically beaten. She's a great writer of short stories, well known all over the world. And she shows exactly what Fairbairn said would happen to you. Her parents beat her mercilessly. She was a child. Her father was a fox farmer, for the fox fur in Canada. And her mother used to, when her father came home, she would say, "Okay, tonight you are beating Alice." And she did this and this and this. And he would say, and Alice said, he really got into it. He beat the hell out of her. And then often at the end of the abuse, the mother would feed her little treats, little favorite foods. Can you imagine a better setup for A, diminishing the size of the central ego because there was no love, and B, increasing the size of the anti-libidinal ego, and C, stimulating the development of a libidinal ego? That's just an unbelievable history. What happened? She went after men that were both exciting and rejecting, and her second husband sexually abused their youngest daughter. And Alice could not hold on to that. The moment the other daughters would say, Mom, Jerry was abusing Andrea, she would shift to a different ego state and not be able to listen or hear. It's just a devastating article, just a wonderful article in terms of validating Fairbairn's model. Okay, that's our that's our short lecture on the structural theory. And we're going to apply these structures to understand what your patient is saying to you. And we're going to try to figure out who's speaking. Is it the anti-libidinal ego relating to you as if you are a rejecting object? Is it the rejecting object who's aggressively demeaning you? There's a huge difference. The anti-libidinal ego is complaining, whining, passive aggressive, negative. Oh, Dr. Celani, you're. Secondly, these ego states shift. And that's what drove me crazy as a young therapist. I couldn't, the patient would come in one ego state and then shift to another one. I realized that these ego states they're not flexible. They're absolutely rigid. And this is a point made by Neil Skolnick, a New York analyst who was one of the editors of Fairbairn Then and Now, a book of collected papers from the 97 Fairbairn conference in New York. I have a paper there. And he talks about the rigidity of these ego structures. They can hear no other truth. They are completely isolated from each other. They don't know about each other. The central ego doesn't know about them. So we have these, and it looks like a multiple personality. It's not. Why isn't it? It's not because it's the same person with a different view. They don't have different genders. They don't know about each other. They don't talk back and forth. They are not as differentiated from each other as is a multiple personality. They're a step before. Okay. And of course, this is a classic description of the borderline personality, of course. All right. I've talked enough. Let's hear our case.